Have we sound? Have we? Hi. I'm normally a stickler for punctuality, so I should probably apologise for the few minutes delay. We were just, there's some people who told us they were on their way and we didn't want them to feel left out. I'm Mike Jennings. I have the great honour of being the chair of TASC, the think tank for Action for Social Change. I'm being told I need to speak more loudly. I'm such a soft-spoken person, you see. We have Orla O'Connor, who is the director of the National Women's Council, and Orla will be chairing the debate, so I'll allow her to do the introductions, but just to say that we're very, very honoured to have Stella Creasy, colleague MP from the United Kingdom, and also Martina Devlin, whom I think most of you will know, at least by reputation, in this country. Can I just say that TASC, as you know, is the think tank for Action for Social Change. And I think it's very important that we should emphasize that aspect of it, that we're not just thinkers and sitting around navel-gazing. We are committed to assisting and fostering real action which will lead to the creation of a fairer and more equal society. We're very dedicated to that, and we're very proud of the work that we do. And I want to, in that regard, thank those of you, because I've every reason to believe that those amongst our generous donors who we rely on so much, because we are completely independent and we value our independence. So I want to thank those of you who have in the past contributed financially to help us to survive more than 20 years in the job that we do. And if any of you haven't so far been a donor, just to let you know that we would welcome it. Not to labour the point, but as I say, our independence is our strength, and we need always to be able to say we're not beholden to any interest group or any status quo merchants. We really want to have that freedom to say what needs to be said in furtherance of a more equal society. So thank you very much for that. A couple of public service announcements which are very, very important. The first is obviously the fire exits. There are two. This door here will lead you out, and I think that one goes down to the car park at the back of the building, if I'm not mistaken, but the important thing is it leads to the outdoors, wherever outdoors is, and there's one at the door where you would have come in. And if, in the event that we do need to evacuate the building, it'll be my second time today. I was over in Bewley's in Grafton Street, and I sat down to enjoy my cup of coffee, and an announcement came, there's an emergency in the building, please walk carefully and slowly to the nearest exit. And I said, So hopefully lightning won't strike twice in the one night, but that exit will you came in and lead down onto the street. So just please do bear in mind that, because it's very, very important that we always have an awareness of that. And can I just say, as a courtesy to you all, to let you know that as we normally do, we are recording and we're actually going to film the event as well. So if for any reason you would prefer not to feature in any pics that might pan the room or anything like that, please feel free to make whatever seating arrangements you think would facilitate your privacy. But if nobody objects, we hope that you will allow us to do that, because we can then put them up on our website. So I'm going to hand over to Orla, and she'll have her few words to say, and I note that she will then introduce her speakers. And it only remains for me to say thank you so much for coming. It's a gesture of support to us that we deeply appreciate. So thank you. Good evening, Orla.
So good evening, everybody. I'm really delighted to be chairing this TASC's Annual Lecture, What is the Point? The Difference the Left Can Make. And this really is an important event for TASC and in the TASC calendar year, because it is a real opportunity for discussion and debate about strengthening our democracy and reducing inequality. And as always, TASC invites those with a real strong track record in driving equality and social change, and tonight is absolutely no exception. And just before I introduce Stella and Martina, just to say, after Stella speaks and Martina will give a response, then there's an opportunity for you to ask questions and to really join in a discussion together, because I think that's where the real richness will come from. So now I'm going to introduce you to MP Stella Creasy, and Stella Creasy is the Labour and Cooperative MP for Walthamstow, and she was first elected in 2010, and she's held a variety of positions within the Labour Party, first as Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Shadow Education Secretary, and then in 2011 as the Shadow Home Office Minister for Crime Prevention. And in Ed Miliband's reshuffle, she ran for deputy leadership for the party in 2015 and came second. And she's currently chair of the Labour Movement for Europe and has campaigned for a continued relationship with the EU and against Brexit. And I know we will be hearing a lot more about that. She's also an avid campaigner and contributor to debates. And I know some of you in this room will know in July 2019, she put forward the amendment which proposed that if Northern Ireland Assembly was not restored by October, that Westminster would legalise abortion in the North. And that was a really significant campaign. And other campaigns have included sexual harassment, childcare provision, and Mother Red, a campaign to financially support mums to be selected and elected as Labour Party candidates in the next general election. So over to you, Stella, and we're so delighted to have you.
Thank you. They say that you can tell how important a politician is by how long it takes to organise to get them to come to something. So if you were to have, say, Barack Obama, probably about a year's worth of machinations. Keir Starmer, a good 6 months, I would have said. But when Orla texted me this morning and said, "What are you doing later? Would you like to come over to Dublin?" I thought I'd love to come, because not least because I'm a massive fan of Orla's work. I am actually on her mailing list. She didn't realise that. But also because I believe this is the question for now. I want to start, if I may, with a quote from James Joyce and the Island of Saints and Sages. And he quotes Oscar Wilde saying that we Irishmen have done nothing, but we are the greatest talkers since the time of the Greeks. Now, I know it would be quite bold to come here to the Royal Irish Academy and critique one of your national icons. So let me just say that I'm very keen to get to the second half of today and hear the great talk that we can have. And the reason why I've titled this talk, "What's the Point?" is because it's a question I know most of us ask every day. Literally, what is the point? Why bother? As a politician, to ask that is not to ask for sympathy. It is to recognise, as an elected politician, even at a national level, we do spend an awful lot of time talking about bin collections. It's not exactly the walking at speed round the West Wing fantasy, even when you're trying to work out which of the 7 bins the current UK Prime Minister is thinking of banning that day. The hours of political engagement are long and often painful. Oscar Wilde was right when he said that the problem with socialism is it does take too many evenings. And the research of online abuse is very clear. 89% of women parliamentarians in 39 different countries said they'd been subjected to various forms of psychological violence. 66% targeted with humiliating sexual or sexist remarks, and 45% with death, rape, beatings, or abduction threats. Amnesty International found that in the UK, although that cut across the political spectrum, minority ethnic female MPs received 35% more of it than white MPs. And this isn't just online. I've lost 2 of my colleagues in the last 7 years alone who were murdered doing this job. Frankly, when I said I was standing for office, my mum asked if I'd considered being an estate agent. Instead, she felt that would be more palatable. So I know that question of why do this? Why do politics? is one that is going to be asked not just whether you have referendums or not, whether we have a general election in the UK possibly in the coming year. Why bother? Does it really make a difference? Are you all the same? Now, I know better to come here also than to lecture you about what you should do about your constitution, but I do know there is a universal challenge for all left-wing politicians, which is the limitations of our resources: time, money, patience. So I can talk tonight about how I approach these questions myself, because I do recognise in the current environment there's a lot of time wasted in this job. With left and right populism on the rise around the world, politics has become short on answers, long on angry. So many political activities are designed to stoke recrimination because it's seen as the way that you sweep to power, with the more extreme, the more eye-catching the mantra. Now, you may think of Trump when I say that. I've lived through Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. It is a source of pride to me that the lettuce who lasted longer than Liz Truss as Prime Minister and consumed British public life for the same length of time was actually in my constituency in Walthamstow. But left-wing leaders too are guilty of political activism as photo shoots and props. We have also lived through fields of people chanting Jeremy Corbyn, Podemos and Mélenchon. What Nye Bevan, the man who delivered the NHS for the United Kingdom, called pure but ultimately impotent, because the desire to be pure, to be perfect, leads to a politics of positioning, not praxis. So if you want change, the first thing you've got to ask is whether there's an answer here, not just an analysis, a step forward to be made. And that doesn't have to be about winning an election. The prize of office is to be able to set the timetable for legislation. But waiting for others to make the political weather for your causes and concerns will leave you waiting a long time. The better time rarely arrives. During the many debates we had on Brexit in the UK Parliament, colleagues thought I was mad at best and at worst a distraction for taking every opportunity I could to talk about abortion rights in Northern Ireland. Picking away at the status quo, showing that there was more than sympathy to be offered to those women facing giving birth with fetal abnormalities, that there was a solution: decriminalisation. Now, in the UK, we are not short of choices for targets to focus our attention and efforts towards. My country is literally falling apart before our eyes. Life expectancy is actually falling in the UK in the poorest parts of our country. 30% of kids live in poverty, 71% of them in families where somebody is in work. And we've had a 26% increase in rough sleeping alone in the last year. The current UK government is a living embodiment of penny-wise, pound-foolish. Austerity has led to so many cuts that the repair bill will far outweigh any savings they ever could have made. It is shocking to me that Ireland is talking about setting up a sovereign wealth fund, and our own Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK is forecasting within 50 years, the way things are going, public sector debt could reach 350% of GDP. 24,000 school buildings in England and Wales are at risk of collapse. And that isn't because they have something you might have heard of called RAC or dodgy concrete. As our current Education Secretary in the UK actually said, there are lots of reasons why a school might collapse. Rape crisis tell us that there are 8,000 rape cases currently waiting for a court date, part of a broader backlog of 62,000 cases. Our NHS has hit a backlog of all-time high this summer of 7.6 million people in need of treatment. That's 1 in 10 of our citizens. Frankly, it's crap right now in the UK. Literally. There were 389,000 discharges of raw sewage into the UK waterways last year alone. That's 1 every 80 seconds. And those are just the here and now problems we could target our attention to. Ours is the first generation that will have a lower quality of life than our parents. We're more unequal than ever before, with the bank of mum and dad being the difference about whether you achieve your potential or not. In the UK now, you can pass on £1 million to your children tax-free. But if your mum and dad aren't on the property ladder now, chances are that you and your grandchildren won't ever be either. Basically, in the UK, work doesn't pay, assets do. It's the same with our exam results that show not only the impact of the pandemic, but the rise in regional inequality, with the grade gap between the northeast of my country and London 10.8%, and the gap between the independent sector and the state sector too. Whoever your parents are, wherever you live, these are the things that define your future in the UK, not your talent. And the conversation we have in the UK on gender is not about talent or any constitutional rights. I mean, we've never had a constitution after all. It's about whether we've gone too far and whether women are still complaining. I mean, we have had now technically 3 female prime ministers and a female head of state in recent history. And at one point, the police and the fire service were both run by women. So I make that 5. I can understand why Piers Morgan was a bit worried. The truth is 4 out of 5 companies in the UK still pay their male employees more than their female counterparts. 2/3 of the LGBT community in the UK have experienced violence or abuse. And black Caribbean boys do 10% worse at exams than the national average. Even our national pastime isn't sacred. It's been hijacked by the Saudi government as a form of reputation management, and the UK government is completely silent. And meanwhile, 700 football pitches have been lost in the last decade. Still, at least we didn't completely isolate ourselves from Europe. We did. Brexit was like setting fire to your hotel at the start of your holiday because there isn't a pool. The Bank of England estimates that the UK has suffered a loss of business investment since 2016 worth 29 billion or £1,000 per household. And the London School of Economics tell us it's added an average of £210 to the household food bill at a time of a cost of living crisis. So you might say to me, well, there you go, that's your motivation. Just be the resistance to this mess. And there might be something worth inheriting for your kids. Take every opportunity to oppose those responsible for it and protect the status quo. But that leads me to the second part of my title, the difference that the left can make. Because all of those are examples of problems, not solutions. And on some of them, actually, at least left and right agree they are a problem. They just disagree on the solution. That dodgy concrete in so many of our public buildings, nobody's actually advocating for unsafe classrooms. But with all UK political parties ruling out changes to our capital gains tax or our corporation tax policies, finding the funding to address this in the bills of austerity isn't going to be as simple as you think. And frankly, on other issues around the world, the left is losing the battle outright that there's a problem at all or that the market shouldn't solve it. 1 in 3 men globally think that feminism does more harm than good, with 1 in 4 men in the UK thinking men have lost out as a result of feminism. Our healthcare services were built for a time when the challenge was transmissible infectious diseases, not the killers of the 21st century, heart disease, cancer, mental health. As a result, the drum for social insurance models, including the private sector, gets louder every day. And the climate crisis is not viewed as crucial to our existence or economic growth, but part of left-wing wokeism. Indeed, the UK Prime Minister has just abandoned net zero and gone up in the polls. Refugees are being treated as second-class citizens around the world, with the Refugee Convention itself now under attack, as is the European Convention on Human Rights. And that previous consensus that we had that tackling world poverty mattered has also been unpicked, even in the face of what was achieved by the Jubilee goals. My own government has abandoned the Department of International Development, and the rights of women in Afghanistan and Iran are just seen as a necessary sacrifice for keeping the peace and reducing military spend. And frankly, no one is protesting. Now, with Labour on the cusp of an election in the UK and you thinking about what you might be able to do with a referendum, asking whether the left can actually make a difference means asking what it means to be left-wing. That lens through which you view the world and also see how change can happen. Because while the right has the market to fall back on to determine life chances, ours is a politics that sees the greater potential in pooling our resources to get the best out of each of us for the benefit of all of us. It's a principle that gathers us together around the world. Whether in a financial or a climate crisis, we are all connected. That also means we can choose to work together, to develop a vaccine, to collaborate as well as compete. But if I think of the world we live in now and the impact of that populism from all sides, I think of W.B. Yeats' Second Coming poem about Irish independence. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The centre is fragmenting, and we are losing the fight for where it goes. Lacking conviction, full of passionate intensity, but on the defensive. And it's not because the right is unassailable. Remember the lettuce. It's because we haven't made an argument in years. We've just presumed we would win the battle of ideas eventually, that if we can see the con, the conspiracy, critically read the Daily Mail or watch Fox News when others can't, eventually others would realise, well, we were right. A political movement founded on collective action and collective ideals, we're terrible at collective action. We're elitist, a group who think we're superior. Because if I've learned anything a bit being involved in the labour movement, it's that winning elections, putting child poverty on the national agenda and cutting it, putting tax rises for public services into a national election campaign and winning it, counts for little if you've lost the argument in the country as well as the office. Because within a decade in the UK, those gains haven't just been destroyed, they've been dismissed and frankly even dumped. Progress doesn't endure unless we are rooted in both our values and our communities, fighting not just at elections or in referendums, but every single day for the ideas and actions that are the hard yard of progressive change to become common sense. So the left has to offer people not just competency and confidence in office, however uncertain things are, but also the promise that that collective action and investment offers a way forward for all of us which far outstrips the market in delivering radical and positive change in our lifetimes. And the honest truth is that is a big ask. It's not hard to see why people feel so worried and insecure, why the populists who offer that immediate answer to what is wrong in the world, and crucially who to blame, are so effective. Every generation has faced difficult challenges: war, enduring poverty, pandemics, financial crashes, climate disasters, or even the odd act of God. But ours is the first generation to see these within a generation and repeatedly. My favourite film of all time is Ferris Bueller. Ferris taught us all that life moves fast. But Ferris's fast was another time when you could play hooky from school and CCTV, the internet and geotagging wouldn't stop you. That film is 37 years old. I know, frightening, isn't it? To recognise just how quickly our lives move, our sense of what the world can do, you only have to think about social media. Social media is not technically old enough to vote yet, but half the world is now on TikTok, something that we only had in the last 6 years. Only a quarter of the world is on Facebook, but it is mentioned in a third of all divorces. Now, you may mention the counterfactual, that when we campaign, we might campaign in caution, but we deliver in office a difference. That in America, Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is Keynesian economics, alive and well, investment in clean energy and reducing the cost of prescription drugs as a means to tackle inflation. The New Deal reborn and the climate are a priority. And that it's not just America. Look at Australia, where a left-wing government has introduced sector-wide union bargaining and pay transparency. It's almost doubled its commitment to emissions reduction. It's upped the childcare cost subsidy so that parents on low incomes only pay 10%. And it's proposed the Indigenous voice referendum. But those stand in stark contrast to the others from the left in office backtracking on refugee rights or slowing the pace of urgency on tackling child poverty, or others offering to do so to get into office. Because in this era of extremes, it is ultimately self-defeating because it raises the risk that the space for the case for change, and politics being the way that it happens, contracts. So much so that that status quo, that centre, tilts to the right and blocks out progressive outcomes, and ultimately blocks them from our future too. And for years, the left used to lose arguments on the economy and win on society. We were nice people, but you didn't want to lend them your wallet for safekeeping. Now the folly of austerity and unchecked global capitalism has shown we're the ones with the grasp for the purse strings. In the UK, people are drowning in public debt and private debt to pay for the Conservatives' mistakes, with little end in sight. But the tragedy is, in winning the argument that our public services need investment because our opponents have broken them, though not actually how to fix them, we're struggling to make a case for a more inclusive society. And that matters in itself because it is a necessary condition for economic and social progress. For getting the best out of each of us for the benefit of all of us, by taking away those barriers to talent that discrimination and division create. And we can see that not least in Brexit. Fundamentally, it should be an argument about trade and internationalism, but it has become a vehicle for cultural divides and isolation. Now, the roots of those divides that were exploited sit far back in British society before the vote or even before the campaign for the vote. In a nation and indeed a world where people are becoming ships that pass in the night, as some have opportunities and other only insecurities. And as the trade impact of Brexit becomes more and more apparent, so that rhetoric roots itself more in isolation than inflation. Brexit has put people in the UK out of jobs. It risks stability in Northern Ireland, and it means we're not even in the venue, let alone at the table when it comes to tackling Putin and the energy security and climate crisis. We're not even there when they're having debates about how many phone chargers we should all have to carry around if we want an Apple phone. Yet still in the UK, we're stuck in a loop, shouting about rejoin or the benefits of Brexit, when neither is achievable. Progressives win not by hiding from arguments, by working on them. And we can see that in the ones that we didn't make as much as the ones we did. With Brexit, we didn't set out our own vision of why international cooperation mattered, meaning the case for staying in ultimately rested on an elitist model of how decisions were made, not empowering an entire continent to come together for common good. But with childcare, we are winning against this tide. Not in Parliament, but from the grassroots with organisations like Pregnant and Then Screwed. In the UK, a quarter of all parents have quit a job or dropped out of education because of the cost of childcare. Our gender payback isn't a gender pay gap, it's a motherhood pay gap, because women of childbearing age, whether they have babies or not, find themselves in a trap whereby their earnings potential falls off a cliff and it never recovers. For so long, though, the debate we had sounded like it was about giving mums more time to go to baby yoga. All the things like Sure Start and nursery investment were seen as lady activities, and it was easy for politicians to lay off funding them. In identifying the loss of talent, of productivity that the lack of childcare represents, and making it an item of economic infrastructure, we've changed the very prospects at stake. That just as we fund tackling potholes, so we should fund parents because both help them get to work and deliver growth. Now our debate is about how much investment should be made, not whether grandparents should do more. It's a reflection of how, when the left stands up, it can redefine the public interest for the common good. That's why we should be ruthless about fighting the future, not the status quo. For all I worry if the Conservatives win the next election in the UK, there will not be an NHS I can pass on to my kids. It has proved resilient to date to their attempts to kill it. But I know if I really want to save it for my kids, we have to win an argument about how it becomes not about beds in hospitals, but preventing conditions like diabetes and heart disease and helping us all live well. And that debate is a long way away. When I first got involved in British politics, the concept of a minimum wage was seen as wild. And I was earning £1.50 an hour working in a bakery after school. Now we have a low pay commission, the idea of a living wage, and it cuts across all political parties. We've won that argument for a floor of funding. Now our opportunity is to win the case of what that wage should be. And here in Ireland, I look to the work that you have done to shift the centre ground, to make things like collective bargaining seem something the government wants to do. And abortion, for all those who oppose it and try to import American tactics and to undermine it, has become the settled will of the people within 5 years, along with gay marriage. But in the UK, where the left is on the defensive, some are arguing that we should not make progress on the decriminalisation of abortion. Now, much as it gives me a wry smile every time I see the DUP that we have the most progressive abortion legislation in Northern Ireland, that would mean that women in Belfast have more rights than my constituents in Walthamstow. It's also the case that when the left is silent on things, it doesn't mean they settle down. They can often fall back. That's because if we don't pull at the centre ground, others will. A recent UK social attitudes survey that said that despite the UK becoming a more tolerant society overall, attitudes towards transgender people have taken a sharp decline. Daily toxic stories mean the percentage of the British public who agree that transgender people should be able to have their sex on their birth certificate has fallen from 56% to 30%. But finally, I want to make clear that having an argument isn't the same as being able to make it. And for that, you need to bring people with you. And I mean not just to vote for you, but actually be your ally in making those arguments day in, day out, for this being the new normal. Because you can't really do anything meaningful with a small number of representatives in office. Progressive activism needs grassroots movements to win, hold, and advance change, not just deliver our leaflets or share our tweets. Our opponents have been organising communities, often online, for years now, and it shows. Andrew Tate is not a one-man band. He's a social movement using networks to spread his poison like wildfire amongst young men around the world to their detriment and the women around them. Conversely, Just Stop Oil in the UK is bleeding goodwill. It's refusing to compromise or engage and actively pushing the centre ground away from its own orbit. So the left may be in trouble because it's stopped arguing, but collective action is still the best vehicle we have to make change happen in the future too. And that's why we bother. That's the difference we make. That's why I'm not an estate agent or even a DJ, which is what I really wanted to be. But it's also why we need to change, each of us, all of us, to be clear about what our answers are and the impact they could have, less willing to see the status quo as enough, and more able to collaborate. As you look to the possibility of a referendum, sometime maybe next year, and that public debate you could have about gender equality, the opportunity to write into your future and your culture the rights of women appears, but it's in your hands to define how you collaborate. In The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, the main protagonist, Stephen, encounters Moynihan, who describes the offer of socialism as a brand new world, no stimulants and votes for bitches. Now, I hope my remarks have at least stimulated you. The opportunity before you, though, should be more about than the value of votes for bitches. It can be to set out that brave new world, but only if the left makes the argument for it now and fights for it. Just as there are Conservatives who seem intent on losing the next election in the UK, there is a window of opportunity for us to regain the advantage and not just be an opposition, but an alternative. Because it is true, in these current circumstances, the centre cannot hold, but it can also be shifted. And in that, our shared future can too. Thank you.
It's on now. Thank you. I just thought that was amazing. And I think, when you said at the end about, I think you definitely have stimulated us all. There was just so much, I think, in what you've said. And I mean, you touched on so many issues that I think will so resonate with people here. But also, I think, showing the stark inequality that exists now in the UK and the challenge to the left, in terms of meeting that, but also the challenge to the left here in Ireland as well. And I think one of the things that I was really struck when you were speaking was your piece, which I will put out on Twitter when this is over. Progress doesn't endure unless we're rooted in our values and communities, and that certainly struck me, and just in terms of thinking about how we try to bring about change in Ireland on so many of the issues that you've touched on. Although in a different space than where the UK is. So yeah, I'm sure there will be lots and lots of discussion. But now, and we're going to turn to Martina Devlin, who's going to, I suppose, again, stimulate us in terms of posing questions. And Martina Devlin is a novelist, newspaper columnist, and playwright. She's written 11 books, including a historical novel about a mass witchcraft trial in County Antrim called The House Where It Happened, and that led to a plaque being erected to commemorate the so-called witches. Prizes that Martina has received include the Royal Society of Literature's Pritchett Prize and Hennessy Literary Award, and she's been shortlisted 3 times for the Irish Book Awards. She writes a weekly current affairs column for the Irish Independent and has been named National Newspapers of Ireland Commentator for the year. And it's a real pleasure to have Martina here. Over to you.
And can I just add my voice to Orla's? That was such a stirring speech. I love to hear a passionate, articulate woman engage the F gear, the feminist gear. There should be more of it. I smiled to hear Stella Creasy quote Joyce, Yeats and Wilde, and I'll be returning the compliment in the course of my remarks by slipping in a little bit of Shakespeare. But first I'd like to reference that wonderful English writer, George Eliot, who said in her novel Middlemarch, "Among all avoidable mistakes, prophecy is the most gratuitous." Even so, I feel inclined to risk a prediction. It seems clear that a Labour-led government is the likeliest outcome of the next British plebiscite, and hopefully we've just been listening to a future Labour and Cooperative Party minister. For the Irish, British elections are more than just a spectator sport. What happens there can affect us here. We have skin in the game. Inevitably, there are many areas of mutual interest for near neighbours who share a land border. The latter has been a source of friction, but the UK Labour Party has a track record as a fence mender, a well-disposed, good neighbour to Ireland. Stella Creasy's presence here this evening suggests someone following in that honourable tradition. Thank you. Our two nations have a complex relationship. But a Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair, along with that prince among politicians, Mo Mowlam, took risks to heal the past. They understood that tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, lead on to fortune. I'm a child of the Troubles, and I want to say here that politicians helped to deliver the most life-changing legislation of my lifetime, the Good Friday Agreement, 25 years old this year. The peace dividend didn't just improve things for Northern Ireland, though, it improved lives right across the island. Politics made something magical happen. That and other repairs to the Irish-British tapestry of interconnection acted as a reminder that we've more in common than divides us. Shared values, shared friends and relatives, shared history, shared passports. There's a great deal of social glue linking us. But Brexit has diluted that glue. Unfortunately, it strained the relationship between our two nations with disputes over trade arrangements and persistent concerns about the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement being dishonoured. There's been a steady drumbeat of mistrust and bad faith, with too many signed-up members of the Alternative Facts Brigade in Westminster. Naturally, Britain has the right to make its own decisions, and we must respect that Brexit is the consequence of a democratic referendum, though there have been bad days at the polling booth. But it's been encouraging to hear Keir Starmer reference the importance of improved working relations with the EU and, by default, the Irish Republic. And with a Labour government, Ireland hopes for smoother diplomatic relations, because we'd like to see Britain acting in good faith again towards Ireland. Since Brexit, that quality has been absent. Stella Creasy said in an article for The Guardian newspaper last year that to fix something, you must first name it. So here goes. Unfortunately, our relationship with Britain has become dysfunctional. As you say, we've lived through Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. Current Premier Rishi Sunak is more pragmatic than those two predecessors, but nevertheless, his actions have left the Irish government admitting publicly that Irish-British relations are at a very low ebb. It's intriguing, therefore, to imagine which steps a Labour-led administration might take to improve relations. Many people on both sides of the Irish border hope a Labour government might restock the goodwill cupboard. This includes being impartial between competing interests in Northern Ireland, something traded away for electoral gain by the Conservative Party. It's feared between being pro-DUP in return for the Confidence and Supply Agreement to simply losing interest in Northern Ireland so that public services are all but collapsing. Northern Ireland has been turned into a dilapidated, disregarded old extension to the Tory house. Not worth knocking down, too much trouble to fix up. People living there, less than 100 kilometres from this room in some cases, deserve better. Our guest speaker mentioned broken services in the UK, but the out of order sign on public services in Northern Ireland is now so widespread it disfigures democracy. Just 2 examples. A few days ago, Libraries Northern Ireland said it had no money for new books. No money for books in a library. And while Stella Creasy has spoken with feeling about Britain's NHS backlog, hospital waiting lists in the north are the worst in the UK. They're also double those of the Republic, according to a Freedom of Information request, which the Irish Times got hold of. So I have 3 questions, if I may, for our most welcome guest to consider if she would. First, how would a Labour government make progress in getting Stormont back in business? Is devolution important to Labour? And before I move on, I want to acknowledge, as you've heard already, how Stella Creasy played a key part in helping to modernise and decriminalise abortion in Northern Ireland. Her amendment removed a ban in place since 1861. That's just one example of how a politician who cares about Irish affairs can make a real difference to people's lived experience. Some politicians never lose the activist gene, I'm glad to say. And so to my second question. Westminster's legacy legislation is causing so much dismay here, the Irish government is considering challenging it in Europe. The legacy legislation denies any possibility of justice to victims and survivors of the Hilary Benn, your party's Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, says that law will be overturned under Labour. So my question is, how high up Labour's agenda is that? My third question is, what's Labour's position on constitutional change in Ireland? Britain's vote to leave the EU has accelerated debate around Irish reunification, along with discussion about how unity might fashion a fairer republic for all. That action on social change referenced at the start of tonight's proceedings, including, not excluding. We live among people who've been sidelined by a more prosperous Ireland. And what of the new Irish? Some who are here as economic refugees and some who are fleeing war. How can they be part of a fairer republic? But a border poll rests in the hands of a British Secretary of State. Ireland's views on the matter, although we're really affected here, are almost irrelevant. So, under which precise circumstances would such a poll be called? Is it demographics, levels of political representation in Stormont, because the British Treasury's had enough? We're in the dark. Could you perhaps share Labour thinking on that, please? Would Labour give certainty by defining the components contributing to the decision? So far, what I've spoken about relates to Irish and British interests, but climate change poses a threat to all humankind. Britain last week watered down environmental commitments, as Stella Creasy noted, to which I'd add the following. Nations as close as we are geographically need to move in the same direction on climate action. And while it's disappointing to smell burning rubber as the Tory machine reverses at speed away from previous promises, maybe there will be a reboot under Labour. As a wise man said, there's nothing permanent except change. I've put some questions out there. I know there'll be others from the floor, and I know too that I'm treating Stella as if she's the oracle at Delphi. I don't expect answers to all of it, but it would be very interesting to hear your thinking on it. Ireland has hopes from a Labour government, and as we know, hope is highly contagious in the best possible way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Martina. I think that is really thought-provoking. And I think your questions, I'm sure, both in terms of Stella's thoughts and opinions, but also I think people here, because I think you've raised some really critical issues in terms of the future of the island, the relations with the North, and also the wider issue of climate justice. Stella, would you like a bit of time to think about them, and I'll see if there's other questions from the floor, or would you like to say something now?
They've had to listen to us for a long time.
Okay, well, I'll come back to you. So if anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment on what you've heard, you're really welcome. There is roving mic, there's a roving mic as well, so maybe if you want to indicate, and then the mic will come to you, just so everybody can hear. So there's a question up here from Ivana. Oh, yeah, the mic, yeah. Just hang on a second, Ivana. Question up here, yeah. There.
Thank you. Ivana Bacik, Irish Labour Party, leader of the party. Stella, lovely to see you again. I look forward to speaking with you, and indeed on the same panel at the British Labour Conference next week in Liverpool. And thank you both for the really stimulating speeches. And Stella, also just to acknowledge your incredible work in achieving abortion reform in Northern Ireland, and also your work on the motherhood pay gap, which we're watching with great interest. I think that's really interesting and an effective way of describing the pay gap in the accuracy that it is about. It is about maternity, and that what we've called, this phenomenon for so many women of finding that's where the pinch occurs in terms of pay and promotional prospects, is when women have children. And Martina, I'm going to engage the F gear, as you've said, as a feminist, and just to comment very briefly on I suppose, Stella, the key question you're asking about the difference the left can make. And I was invited to speak at the weekend at a conference, strangely in New York, but about the future of the left in Europe. Involving academics and public representatives from social democratic and socialist parties across Europe. And the big dilemma facing the European left, if I can say broadly, is the fragmentation of the left. And I'm just interested, Stella, on your commentary on that, coming from the very different British tradition of a very binary, Tory. All you've said is very much about what we all hope will happen when Labour comes into power in Britain. It's a different perspective when we are speaking in a European context, in countries where the left has fragmented, even in countries where that you've had a tradition of a big socialist party, where that's now, as in France, as in Germany, we're seeing splinters and further left parties. So that's one question. And then secondly, just to finish, is about the care referendum and the care and equality referendum that Orla and I are going to be doing a press call on tomorrow, because I chaired the Gender Equality Committee here in the Oireachtas, which produced wording for government on precisely what to put to the people to ensure that we would delete the sexist language about women from the Constitution, achieve a more inclusive definition of family, and crucially provide a valuing of care. And we believe that's a really important referendum, that there will be a big campaign not just obviously for the left, but for anyone who wants to see a progressive change on care in Ireland. And I would just put this out, and again, it's about really the future of the left, that the left has traditionally been about rights at work and workers' rights and the trade union movement. Certainly that's my tradition as the leader of the oldest party in the state and of the Labour Party, the political wing of the trade union movement. But we have to also, I think, become seen as the party or the movement of care, because care is hugely important in all of our lives. It's really important in communities. It's really important, it's really important to deliver equality, which for me, and you've outlined it so well, Stella, is what the left is about delivering equality. So just a few points that, I'd be interested in your response on. Thank you.
There's your mic there. Yeah.
Sorry. Showing my age, but I'm looking for the on button, and clearly things. I mean, I have toddlers now that just look at everything and do that, including paper, because I don't understand why things don't. And thank you for the kind reception to what I was saying, and also to both Martina and Yvonne. I should say you are one of my heroes, and I met you when we were marching to repeal. And I remember, and you were just at the start of kind of the leadership role that you were in, going on to play. And it's been incredible to watch you and to see the work that the left is doing in Ireland under your leadership. And one of the reasons I'm here is because I think we need to rehabilitate the practice of solidarity with the left around the world, that we can share ideas and share ways of winning arguments and talking about things. And we can learn from you, because it would make my heart sing for the concept of care to be part of British political thinking, not just because it's about care for children, and so often that's seen as the preserve of mothers, but because it's also women who are tending to look after and take the bone for social care in the UK. And in the UK, those things have been segregated. The fact that you are talking about it as a constitutional equalities issue is the place where we're going to make progress on getting the outcomes that we need, and it also not being about women bearing the burden and women having to find the solution, but the impact on society. And I hope that we can learn from you and what you achieve whenever you do get the referendum, in how we can change that conversation in the UK. I also take your point about fragmentation, and I think it's really important that we don't think that's about the electoral system, because actually in the left in the UK we've had similar pressures and similar powers about populism. My political party went through that, is still having that conversation with itself in the way that we've seen across Europe. And I think it's a really interesting challenge for progressives around Europe, that if Labour comes to power in the UK, what role can we play? Because we've shut ourselves out of the room where the conversations are taking place. I'm very mindful as somebody who served on the Council of Europe between 2015 and 2019 and watched as the AFD walked into the room, as the Five Star Movement, what was happening in Sweden, what was happening in Denmark, and the voices that were changing in the room. And I served on the Refugee Committee, so you can imagine what it was like as they came in and the arguments that they were making. That is why I'm absolutely passionate that we cannot win those arguments alone. Frankly, one of the things that Europe failed at was supporting refugees to make it possible for all of us to live up to those values. The fact that we all kind of gave up is the space into which the current UK Home Secretary is now walking into to suggest that we shouldn't have to try at all. So things can always get worse as well as better. But you are right about what role can we play to be a countervailing force. And I think that's a real responsibility on us. One of the reasons why I took on the role of chair of the Labour Movement of Europe was because I wanted to stop having the arguments of 2016 and 2019 in the UK. I want to have the argument of 2025. That is obviously going to be about our working relationship with Europe, but it's also about our potential to be those allies, to be solidarity for the different kind of future we want that we cannot achieve on our own. Martina is right on climate change. It is a source of embarrassment to me. I mean, it was actually a bit of a flashback, because we got so used under Liz Truss to just laughing at the government, and then Rishi Sunak started doing the same thing last week. I don't know if any of you saw, I don't know how well it went around, this thing about we're going to ban 7 bins, and everyone was like, only you would think of a kitchen with space for 7 bins. No one's talking about it. He was going to ban compulsory car sharing. To be honest, I was in favour of that, because I couldn't think of anything worse than sharing a car with somebody who wouldn't let me put the stereo on and make me listen to Ed Sheeran. But it was facile politics trying to tap into this populist tone on one of the most important issues that actually the UK is falling behind Europe on. And that matters not because we'll lose the economic benefits and all the green jobs that could come, but because we'll end up the polluters of Europe, the way things are going with this government that we have in the UK. And that will affect you in Ireland. It will affect people across the European continent. And it will also affect our capacity to work globally. And if we look at COP, I think that the mixed fortunes have come from that hesitation about taking net zero and saying, yes, this is going to be different, but it's also going to be better. So I see a whole range of issues on which the left has to find a way of working collaboratively again, internationally as well as locally. And our responsibility in the UK is to recognise that we've been terrible at that. You know, I say the roots of Brexit, people keep asking me whether we could rejoin. And I'm like, well, the question you've got to ask is whether the European Union would have us back. We're a bit like that awful man your aunt married and you've had to put up with him at Christmas for years and years and years. Finally, she's divorced him. You're not going to want to come round for a cup of tea, are you? You know, we have got to show that we're willing to work on those issues. I think we should do that through our sister parties. I think we should be very clear that the Party of European Socialists and those links matter, because it's also about the ideas and the cultural exchange that could come and the commitment to tackling things, because pollution doesn't stop at borders. The converse of that is also true, and that's Martine's question about devolution. Devolution is absolutely integral to the left. Now, I speak as a humble backbencher. I am not part of the front bench in the Labour movement. You know, I am there with the freedom to say what I think, but also to be able to challenge, take on some of those difficult conversations. Devolution is absolutely a difficult conversation for the left because it has become one that has become mired in structures rather than principles about why it matters to have self-determination. You mentioned the Good Friday Agreement and Mo Mowlam, and I had the privilege as a young political activist to meet Mo Mowlam. It was extraordinary. I mean, a different time and era, because of all of us share common stories of telling of lighting cigarettes for her, which clearly isn't a good thing to have been doing as an 18-year-old. But Mo's enthusiasm for the change that could be achieved was infectious. And actually, it wasn't about individual details. It was about the principle that A, we could make progress, and B, that was about empowering and emancipating people. And self-determination is about emancipation. And I look at the Good Friday Agreement, and the questions that you ask are absolutely fair and right questions. Yes, absolutely, we must repeal the legacy legislation. We've committed to that. But more importantly, that we must take time to rehabilitate the concept of emancipation and self-determination that was part of the Good Friday Agreement that was so precious to people and was why people took that leap together. And we know how hard that leap was. And when I look at the UK government, not just trashing the Good Friday Agreement with the Northern Ireland Protocol, but and still listening to people like David Frost. David Frost really is the man you wish your aunt hadn't married, that you would just like a period of silence from. But also now dismissing and minimising the European Court of Human Rights and the importance of that body and what it has achieved and what it stands for in terms of values around the world. And I know we have to do more than say, oh, well, let's talk about it. We have to mount a full-throated defence for the important principles behind it. Because what Mo did was make it impossible to say no to the potential that it offered. And now I'm still in touch with her children. And, you know, we're all a lot older, I say. When I think about the fact that Ferris Bueller is 37 years old, it just makes me weep. Not least because when I've tried to show it to my staff, they just don't understand it. It's another world for them. But if we want to live those values, we have to rehabilitate the capacity to create moments of magic, as you say, embed them and learn from them. And at the moment, the Good Friday Agreement itself is at risk still by what this government is doing in the UK. I want to be part of a Labour in-office team that not only upholds the Good Friday Agreement, but builds on it and learns from where devolution, if we're honest, has still become about dry technical meetings and not that power of emancipation. So for people like me, and I come from the cooperative movement of the Labour Party as well, whether it is in Northern Ireland, whether it is in Scotland, in Wales, in London, actually we have to get out of the town halls, the civic halls. Of course we've got to get Stormont up and running, but one of the things that made me incredibly proud to be part of the work we did in Northern Ireland, please don't think it was me. It was all those brilliant, brilliant women, and it was mainly women in Northern Ireland, who said, up with this, we will not put any more, and organised and mobilised and started to exercise their voice. And all I was privileged enough to do was to give them a platform and to refuse to say that Ian Paisley Jr. or Geoffrey Robertson were the only voices from Northern Ireland that should be heard. And so for me, devolution has to go much further. It has to be about those grassroots and how you connect people up. Because also the thing that makes me incredibly proud is so many of those women now have gone on to do all sorts of other things for Northern Irish society, because in that moment, suddenly they were heard and they were seen, and that's what emancipation should be. So absolutely, there is a process for constitutional change, but there is a culture that you need to embed, and we've lost both, and we need to rehabilitate both, because Oscar Wilde is right, it can't just be about the meetings, it has to be about the praxis, and that comes from the grassroots up.
You answered a lot of questions. Easiness about the terms of the border poll.
Well, that's set out in the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, it isn't. It's just within the gift of the British Secretary of State, and we don't really know. I mean, it's when he or she thinks it's the right time, fundamentally.
Well, so for me, it matters that there is a process set out in the Good Friday Agreement. I can't make an argument that we should start upholding the international treaties and commitments and promises we've made to a community and then say, but I would override them in X, Y, or Z ways. I do think it is important to recognise with a feeling in the community. So for me, the Good Friday Agreement needs to be treated with the respect that it was intended to, and I think has been lost in the last 2-3 years in particular.
But there's a creative ambiguity in the Good Friday Agreement. It doesn't actually specify. It just gives, it's within the gift of the British Secretary of State, who doesn't need to consult with Ireland, and we don't exactly know which.
So what part of the Good Friday Agreement process would you keep?
If other people want to come in, okay. So yeah, Louise, and there's a man over here. So.
Thanks a million, Orla. It's great to hear the power of the left, and it's really appreciative of hearing the power of the left. But one of the things that really worries me is that in the last, say, 10 to 15 years of austerity, lone parents, working class women were very disenfranchised, and they suffered the most through austerity. And a lot of those women, and I hate admitting it, but I can see them being, because they are the brunt of social welfare cuts, because they're suffering social housing, the lack of social housing, they're more at risk of homelessness, all of these horrible things they're locked out of the jobs market because of a national childcare scheme that was really designed around civil servants 9 to 5 hours, Monday to Friday, not about people working in hospitality, retail, the care sector, which most lone parents are. They are turning to the right because left women let them down. And I think I'm ashamed to see lone parents doing that, but I understand them, but I also hate them being demonized for making these choices that were foisted on them because of the situation they're in. They see migrants coming in, they think they're at the back of the queue for housing. That's not the case. But I mean, if you're waiting 10 years for a house and you're in a homeless accommodation, you're going to fall for these right-wing tropes. You're locked out at work, your social welfare is being cut, all of these things. And I think it's really frightening to me to see so many really working class women who've, lone parents specifically, who are turning to the right wing because left wing women have let them down over the last 10 years. And how do we bring those women back in? Because they're not bad women, and they're being demonized because they're going to these protests because they're angry with a system that has failed them. How do we bring these women in, back into the fold? How do we not, how do we address that and as left-wing women, acknowledge the hurt we've done to them and bring them back into the fold? I think that's so important.
Stella, do you want to take a couple? Oh yeah, okay, I'll take it.
My name is Philip McDonough. As an Irish diplomat in London, I was the person who mainly established relations with Mo when she was made the spokesperson replacing Kevin McNamara. So Mo and John became our very close friends, and they visited us at home shortly before Mo died, and she could hardly climb the stairs. And Mo always used to challenge me when I spoke to her about whether I was speaking to a brief, and she used to say, "But what does your brain tell you?" But happily there was never much difference. But Mo, in the light of that attitude of hers, I think would be happy if I were to intervene with a couple of ideas. Since leaving Foreign Affairs, I've been working with the churches on the island of Ireland, and they're trying to build on the Good Friday Agreement by looking at wider issues such as the economy, future of Europe, and in particular, most recently, food security. And I think we've found that food security, along with climate change, is a very important lens for looking at politics, because it brings in the limits of the competitive model, the idea of efficiency and incentives. It brings in the question of good work, and it brings in the question of care and community. So my first suggestion is a much closer focus on food security at home and globally. And then my second suggestion is a procedural suggestion, which is about engaging with faith communities. I think Keir Starmer went to a Methodist church during the last Labour Party conference, and I think there's a big future in that, and in political parties who capture that aspect of the life of faith communities, which is committed to social change. Pope Francis the other day was photographed at the coffin of Giorgio Napolitano, the leader of the Communist Party of Italy, not a believer. I would also mention factually in that connection that the leadership of the organization called Churches Together Britain and Ireland is based in Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Is there other? Yeah, over here.
Thanks, and thanks for the fascinating talk, especially about why bother. You know, why bother indeed? Well, a lot of the reasons that we're wondering about why we bother with things in politics and in the left in general would be the lack of hope, in my opinion. And I think that's one of the areas where the left is really falling down, because what the right does very, very, very successfully is fear. Okay? And what we've got to do, surely, in both the UK and here in Ireland, it's one of the areas where we are absolutely falling down. If I could expand it, it fights the thing that we were talking about the single mothers who are falling into poverty traps. A teacher friend of mine teaches in a school here in Dublin, a primary school here in Dublin, where 22% of the population of the school are homeless. 22%. So we have to fight that. We have to fight and give people hope. Hope not only in what we can achieve, but also hope that we can, on the left, actually do it. So Barack Obama, it's all about hope, and yes, we can.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
I don't have a question. It's in relevance to the lady in the white jacket there had put her finger on the point, because up to that I felt I was in a daze here of a middle-class argument, which, I mean, I find strange. The Labour Party and its original ethos in politics and trade unionism. And trade unionism has been bashed over the years since Margaret Thatcher brought in deregulation and cheap labour and turning it into a new Hong Kong when they knew you had to get out of Hong Kong. And I find I worked in a charity here, and it's not so long ago that Irish women here were going to Britain for abortions because they couldn't have one here because of religious boundaries and the Catholic Church still having a hold on the government here. And I also saw Irish women here, even up to recently, because I had to walk away from it because I was so upset. This is a rich country in terms of there's tons of money, apparently, tax dollars sitting in the coffers. And what we've got is queues for food in a charity in Montrose Square every week, where not just single parents or single mothers struggle with young children, but there's also male and there's grandmothers rearing children from generational unemployment, generational uneducated or struggling people through generations living in corporation enclaves that are not being properly looked after by Dublin City Council. They're being run into the ground and sold off to the private developers, which is happening around Grand Canal Street because it's prime property, Dublin 2 and 4. And I find it just disingenuous that the Labour Party would sit and talk about all these middle class, ordinary women, working class women, don't need childcare because their families mind their children while they go out and scrub rich people's toilets and kitchens. They work in the black market because they can't get an education, because they can't get their children minded, or they can't move up any ladder because they're stuck in a council flat or a council house. And then they spend their lives struggling, and then they end up then minding parents, and it's a trap. And it's going to be still a trap until their children are lifted into education, or their children are taken from a very early age and educated properly. And then the children are lifted out of poverty. And education's the key to lifting people out of poverty.
Okay, thank you. Because I think you're really right to raise the issues of child poverty. And we've just had a whole week, last week, in terms of looking at all of the issues in terms of child poverty and what needs to happen, but also for women. Thank you. There's a lot in that. And Stella, can I ask you to add in, because I wanted to ask you something, so I'm going to take the opportunity as chair, but I'm interested as well in knowing a little bit more about the campaign, Mother Red, because it's such an issue here in terms of the low representation of women in politics, but particularly women with children is just, they're just not there. And I'm just really interested to know what the campaign that you were doing, if you can add it in.
Let me try and bring all of these together, because I hear you and I feel your frustration. I cannot talk about the ins and outs of Irish politics. I would not patronise you like that, but I have been part of debates in the UK. I continue to be part of debates. Like, one of the things that made me very proud of the last Labour government, I remember it incredibly powerfully, was the commitment to end child poverty. Not just to reduce it, but to actually end it. And actually, we were making massive strides into it. Now, 40% of the community that I represent, the kids are living in, and the parents are in work, so you're right, madam. There's a whole range of issues around that. One of the reasons many of us have come back to childcare, in the UK, people are spending more on childcare than they are on their rent, and I represent I have the 9th highest level of child poverty in the country in my constituency, and it's housing costs and it's childcare. And if you're renting and you're going to try and get your kids into work at any type of work, and you're absolutely right, the model doesn't fit for people because it presumes people work a certain pattern. And one of the things I'll blow my own trumpet on, I know it's a terrible thing that women do, they feel embarrassed about it, but one of the things I'm really proud of in the last week in Parliament, in getting this economic infrastructure, so getting childcare to be seen as something that you spend your sovereign wealth fund on, because it is something that benefits everybody. Workplace nurseries has been the thing that we've now opened up to say to people, actually, it shouldn't just be about, people who are able to take their kids to a nursery at a school. It should be about, where are people being asked to work when? People who are working in the NHS working late shifts. It doesn't work out for people. There was a point when the current Secretary of State for Work and Pensions in the UK wrote a letter to 1 million women who were on social welfare to say, have you thought about going back to work? Because as if it hadn't occurred to them, and actually it was a brilliant moment because the debate has changed. So one thing I want to do is give you hope that something that feels, and I would say this very openly, as somebody who's campaigned on all sorts of critical issues in the UK, the thing I've had the most abuse on, the thing I've had the most hostility on, is mums. And that's from within my own political movement. Because it's almost like we've accepted that motherhood should be a struggle. It should be rubbish. It should be I don't remember that vote. I definitely don't remember the referendum where we all signed up for the idea that having kids was meant to be a terrible, horrible, difficult, no. And changing that dynamic and recognising that we don't just need childcare, we need to reform what we call universal credit, because there are so many perverse incentives, especially for single parents, and that we need to recognise the talent that we are losing by not investing in making it possible to make things work, that so many people in the UK have too much month at the end of their money, has been about so much more than the individual. Like, we're winning that argument. The backlash will come, and I can see that backlash coming, and it comes from people saying, well, what are the grandparents doing? And that's why we have to keep challenging and being very clear that this is an equalities issue and it's an economics issue, because we're missing out on the potential of people. But where I also take heart from that, and it's the things, apologies, I don't know your name, but you're absolutely right, the anger and frustration that you feel. I'm somebody who, and it fits in with what you're saying, Philip. So my mum helps run the local night shelter. And that is run through the churches in our local community. And it is transformational because it isn't just about finding a bed for people. It's about saying, actually, you matter and we need to work out what are you going to do. There was a time I came home and discovered my mum taking all my saucepans out of my kitchen. And she was like, look, you're a rubbish cook anyway. You don't do very much cooking. One of our clients needs these. And I was like, fair play. But actually the creativity and commitment and care and above all respect that the night shelter brings, because the faith informs the approach, it's not the only way of doing it. And I think it's really important to say that that what faith brings is a particular motivation, but also so can political justice. And I hope in what I've said tonight is that one of the reasons I'm so frustrated with the left is I want us to fight for things, because when we fight, we win, but we also show that it makes a difference, that we do empower and emancipate other people by saying, actually, people shouldn't be sleeping rough. The last Labour government set up a thing called the Rough Sleeping Unit and ended street homelessness in the UK. We've now had a 26% increase in it in the last year alone. Those are political choices behind what happens, but it isn't just about finding housing. Housing matters, and of course you're right. When people set up the idea that there needs to be a loser for you to succeed, that is what the right offers. And they start with refugees, and then they go on to people on benefits, and then single parents, and then it tends to be women, and then it's generally anybody who isn't a white man of a certain age with a certain background who had a nanny. But it isn't enough to call that out. We have to offer an alternative, and it can't be an alternative that is so pure it's impotent. It has to be rooted in what we can do now and how it works. What I take strength from is, even in the most horrific circumstances of the abandonment of the Rough Sleeping Unit, that church night shelter is making a difference. So a Labour government coming into office shouldn't put out of business the night shelter. It should find a way to learn from it and collaborate. Because where the left, I think, has gone wrong in the past is kind of saying, well, now we're in charge, you don't worry about this. And actually, if I think about the challenges and I think about the kind of society we want to live in, I don't want to live in a world where we think only 650 people in a place that looks like Hogwarts gone wrong, which is basically the UK Parliament, have any power or any influence. I want to live collaboratively in solving these problems and pooling our resources, whether it is climate change at an international level or homelessness in my local community. That's where you get hope from, sir, is showing by deed and word that you are in it together. Not that you are there almost like the Fabians, H.G. Wells, to come and do things to people, but actually you are there with them because this is our community and our country and our cause. And where the people like Andrew Tate and Donald Trump have done so well, and Boris Johnson, if we're honest, Boris Johnson is a man who is incredibly wealthy, incredibly privileged, but people think he's a man of the people. It's the greatest sleight of hand is to say, I'm with you, when you don't mean it. We have to show through word and deed how we're with people and be honest enough and humble enough to recognise that we haven't got that right. And we haven't always worked with people and shown people that they can be part of their own solution, because with the greatest will in the world, as we've lacked intent, we've brought a conviction that's actually taken us down the wrong path. We haven't recognised and respected grassroots communities and the role that they can play. And particularly in the UK, we haven't had that debate, and that comes from the trade union movement, where actually when you collaborate together, the best trade unions, there's no strikes at all because they're working hand in hand with employers to constantly innovate and constantly make a community. It's not about a relationship of conflict, it's about a relation of collaboration. Whether it is rough sleeping, whether it is our workplace rights, because our trade unions have to respond to fact. I mean, in the UK, we're almost at a point now where as many people are self-employed as working in the public sector. That is a completely different environment to organise in. The best of the left will always challenge itself, will always live in that future, will look at what is happening now. And that is the same whether it goes to what you could do with that referendum and what you can do around care, as it is about the workplace, as it is about climate crisis. We don't give up on hope because we know we can do something. We just know it's bloody hard work. And we've got to stop doing it for people and do it with people. But I wouldn't be sitting here, I wouldn't be putting myself through British politics if I didn't think that was possible. I come today not to tell you how to do it, but to ask to work with you, because the challenges that we're all going to face in the next 5 to 10 years will affect us all. And we can learn from you, and I hope you can learn from us, but we can also rebuild the idea that progressive politics makes a difference. Because actually, whether you're talking to people in France, whether you're talking to people in America, whether you're talking to people in the UK or here, there's a question mark. And until we're honest about this, Martina quoted me saying, you've got to name a problem to be able to fix it. Until we're honest about the fact that people have found the left wanting because they don't think it delivers and they don't understand their role in it, we won't be able to change that. But if we do work in that different way, if we do cede that control and actually start collaborating, we can again transform a generation. Otherwise, there is no hope.
Thank you. We have probably time for, there's a gentleman out there.
Hi, David Kitching's my name. First of all, I was very heartened by a lot of what you said in the speech and the fundamental decency with which you made your presentation. But probably more so was your reference to being rooted in community and in values, because therein lies the actual politics of the left. And I'm just looking from this distance in terms of the presentation of the Labour leadership currently, it is kind of set up against an incompetent administration and making a presentation based on competence and maybe well-run technocracy, but that's not a political delineation. So just in terms of maintaining that rootedness in values and in community, how do you see the conversation developing whenever a next Labour government might arrive, in terms of how are you going to defend that basis for our politics?
And if there's, is there any more questions? Because this will be the last. Yeah.
I was working as a nurse in London, and I stood outside Downing Street the day Margaret Thatcher left to make sure she didn't get back in again. And I happened to be in London there last year, and I stood outside Downing Street and watched Liz Truss leave. It was a coincidence. But what struck me was there was a few sad... struck me was that a few sad tourists like myself and some anti-Brexiteers, there was no English people there. There's no protests outside Downing Street. Is there an apathy in England about politics? No, the way like 17 million people voted for Brexit. Would you like to see something like PR, like the system we have here, instead of first past the post into your politics?
Thanks. Yeah, I think, okay. So, and it's probably final words as well, if there's anything you want to add.
I'm conscious I've dominated things.
People are fed up of me going on about border posts.
No, I don't think so.
So, apologies, thank you. Thank you so much for keeping watch. But also, she's not gone. And, British politics is a funny old beast in its capacity. And again, that's why I go back to, actually, the left has to challenge for that centre ground. Not because it has to be centrist, but we have to challenge for what people think is possible, but also important. And that kind of goes into your question, David. I have in my head two rules that I think we need to live by as the left. The first is what I call the RuPaul rule. And if anybody here watches Drag Race UK, you'll know there's a much more explicit version of it where he says, but don't mess it up. The honest truth is, if the Labour Party doesn't win the next election, we will have been out of power longer than we were when Margaret Thatcher and John Major came into play. It has never been more important to win an election, because it's like they at the moment are taking a kind of flamethrower to what is left of the dregs of public services, of the social contract that we have with people. Rishi Sunak may present as a more pragmatic Conservative, but he is more than willing to dip his toe into that right-wing populism. He is more than willing to use not just dead cats, but people's lives, people's feelings. That figure about the debate about trans rights in the UK breaks my heart. It also breaks my heart because I know it causes people to have concern about standing up for equalities issues in other parts of the world. So they win even when we don't want them to win. If we don't stand together and say, this is not the world we want to live in. I was somebody who grew up under Section 28 in the UK. I remember watching friends at school who were struggling and teachers telling them not to talk to them because they were frightened, because Section 28 told you that a child couldn't come forward and say, Miss, I don't know what to do. And we are back at that again. We're back at a point where we're saying that we want schools to out children to their parents. And all of us know that we want parents to work with our kids. And all of us know of examples where parents struggle with the choices that their children make. And we're back at that relationship again. And there's just some lines in the sand. It's the same with the refugee convention. Because if we don't challenge, that for me is the second rule. So the first rule is don't mess it up. Say mess, I'll get in trouble if I swear. The second rule is don't waste the chance. I look back now on the things that I say that Labour government achieved, and I didn't agree with a lot of the things. I mean, look, I've been involved in the Labour movement now for over 30 years, and I've disagreed with every Labour leader on something, and I've campaigned for every Labour leader to be Prime Minister, because I'm a woman who knows her own mind and knows that I'm not always right about things, but I want to be part of a living, breathing movement that uses every single opportunity to build that better world. And you get into power to make that process faster. You don't get into power to start that process. So for me, this has to be big, not just because of the scale of the things I talked about at the start, about how bleak it is in the UK, but because of the potential. I represent a place called Walthamstow. If you haven't been there, you should. It is God's own country. It has changed all of your lives in ways that you probably don't even realise. Not just because many of you will know the musical stylings of the great genius Brian Harvey in East 17 and Stay Another Day. You're welcome. But also because there's a place called St Andrew's Road in Walthamstow that created Andrex, so it gave you the Andrex puppy. It also was a place where it's an adult audience created Durex, so rubber gloves and condoms were also things that we helped create. And it also gave an education to Johnny Ives, which if any of you have got an iPad or an iPhone, he invented them. So something you use to entertain yourself when you leave this place tonight will have come from Walthamstow in its roots and its hearts, because we have talent. But that talent is being written off because a bank of mum and dad is the difference between those kids being able to achieve it and change your lives. And it's not just in Walthamstow there's talent. There's talent here in Dublin. There's talent in Belfast. The point about the left is that we refuse to give up, but we go big, because when we get those opportunities to make progress quicker, we have to take them. The scale of change in this world is so quick that it is entirely plausible that Liz Truss could come back. Kwasi Kwarteng, stranger things have happened. Boris Johnson, don't think he's gone. But none of that should matter if we are clear about the difference we could make together. And that's what I think is missing from left-wing politics. And I think, if we're honest, is missing as a sense of motivation around the world. We are just a particularly bleak example of the scale of the importance of winning being so great and the challenge of the job to come. Now, again, I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't think we could make that difference. For me, that's also the answer to your question about PR. Look, I'm somebody who's campaigned for electoral reform all my life, not because I think it would make a difference to any of these issues, just because I think it's the right thing to do. I think I'm a Democrat as well as a socialist. I don't think our system fits the bill. But these are deep-rooted cultural challenges, and changing the electoral system will not make a difference. I've learned that not least from Scotland, where the division of nationalism has meant that people have ignored horrific deterioration in their health and social care and education services because people have been arguing for years and years about whether they'd have a second referendum. And wherever you stand on that issue, the fact that kids in Scotland are getting a raw deal should be the primary concern for progressives. So absolutely, some kind of electoral reform, and for me that's also about our House of Lords, is an important part of a more progressive society. But we have to be honest with ourselves that we are losing the battle for the future, and we're losing it on an ideas basis and an argument basis. That people dismiss Andrew Tate, haven't been into local schools and listened to the kids who will talk excitedly about watching his videos and how he is a countercultural hero, and then about what that means about the relationship between men and women. That the fight for equality isn't with my father's generation, it's with my son's generation. That should trouble us all who've lived through when progressive governments get into power and in losing office. I think we can win that battle, but I think we have to fight it in the grassroots, and we have to work together in the grassroots to make that happen. Because I also know if we can win that argument in the UK, it helps win the argument in Ireland, and it helps win the argument across Europe. And it isn't just about the Andrew Tates, it's about Jean-Marie Le Pen, it's about Giorgia Meloni, it's about the AFD, all these people who will come and fill that gap, who will pull the centre, not just to the right, but to the populist right. And we will watch generation after generation of young people pay the price for it. And it will be the weakest and the vulnerable who will start with, but we will all be poorer for it. There don't have to be winners and losers. There can be a better world. But we have to be honest that we haven't played our part for a long time now in making that argument, and get on and do it. If you take nothing away from this evening, take the American adage about don't mourn, organise. We can all sit around and find fault with the left, or we can get on and sort out and win elections and win hearts and minds again. It is worth it. Why bother? Because it's worth it more than anything. It's just we have to do it in a way we haven't done it before, and that's the hardest thing of all. It's like watching a 2-year-old with an iPad and thinking, I am out of my depth here. I need to get in my depth because he needs me to be better for him. And every parent understands that, and every community needs that. We have to be the answer. Simple as.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stella. Martina, do you want some final comments? To make a final comment?
I suppose what I'd just say quickly is that it's obviously a very different electoral system here. And just listening to Stella talk about her, the British system, I'm quite grateful for our system where it isn't first past the post, where parties which have quite different views in many areas learn that if they work together, they can deliver some of their aims, if not all of them. It's a reminder that the excellent can be the enemy of the good or the very good. It's what's achievable. The other thing that has struck me listening to tonight's conversation, because it has felt like a conversation, is that grassroots activism really, really works. And we know that in Ireland, but it's good to be reminded of it. We know it because it was the people who, activists, but the people were those activists who pushed and prodded and nudged some members of the political class to introduce legislation, which not all of them, were comfortable about. But the two most recent referendums, the marriage equality and the repeal the 8th. And by the way, I saw a photograph of you wearing a repeal sweatshirt in the House of Commons. Those referendums were people power, and they were people driven. And of course, we needed politicians to help to deliver them, but it was very much the voices of the people being raised. And so I think it's important for us to remember that, and on other issues, realize that we can make our views heard and politicians will listen. Thank you.
Thanks, Martina. So that brings us to an end of this part of this evening. So I really, on behalf of TASC, want to thank Martina, I think, for being really thought-provoking and raising critical issues. And also a huge thanks to Stella. I think it's about thanking you for coming here and giving such a brilliant input, and also in terms of the way I think you've responded to the issues raised. But also, I think, being a woman in politics is hard. Being a feminist in politics is even harder. And, you said earlier, before we started, about being the saint of unpopular causes. And I think that's very much describes, I think, sometimes being a feminist in politics and in public life. So thank you for what you do and for the leadership that you show and the role model that you are for women. So the conversation can continue because TASC invites you to a glass of wine, and there's a wine reception now for a little while, so you get to continue this conversation. But let's now give a round of applause to Stella and Martina.